1851, Carolina. On the Harper plantation, the sun rose not with promise but with command. The overseer's horn split the air like a blade, summoning bodies from the quarters before the dew had lifted from the grass. It was the kind of morning where breath showed white in the cold, but sweat was already certain before noon. Esther Jones stepped into another day of servitude, her bare feet pressing the worn dirt path that led from the slave quarters to the big house. At 35, her body carried the weight of 3 decades of labor. Her hands cracked from lie, her back knotted from bending over tubs and hearths, her silence rehearsed to perfection. Esther was cook and laundress, servant and scapegoat. The woman who kept the Harper household warm, fed and clothed, yet was treated as little more than a piece of the furniture. Humiliation was her daily bread. When guests arrived, the master made her scrub the front steps, as if her bent back were part of the spectacle of wealth. They would watch, sipping from glasses of port, as she scoured each stone, her ragged skirt clinging to her knees, the lye burning her hands. Sometimes they smiled, sometimes they pointed, sometimes their children laughed aloud. One winter afternoon, Harper decided to test his authority in front of company. Esther brought out a tray of biscuits, the butter shining on their tops. But she set the platter down the wrong way, handles facing the mistress instead of the guests. The master struck her across the temple with the back of his hand so hard she heard bells ringing in her head. The guests laughed, thinking it part of the evening's entertainment. For days afterward, her ears rang like broken church bells, and when she bent down to scrub the kitchen floor, blood trickled from her nose onto the boards. The town fair was worst. Harper prided himself on a twisted generosity. He would lead Esther out, set her near the livestock pens, and allow visiting children to spit on her. For fun, he said, chuckling with his peers. The children obeyed eagerly, testing their aim on her cheeks and forehead while she stood still, jaw clenched, apron soaked with filth. To wipe her face too soon invited punishment. To resist was unthinkable. Only when the master waved his hand could she clean herself, dragging the hem of her skirt across her skin until it grew stiff with dried spit. The Harper plantation itself stood as a contradiction of wealth and rot. The house was white-pillared, its porch lined with rocking chairs, its parlor stuffed with velvet curtains and gilt-framed portraits. But behind that facade, the walls smelled of sweat, tobacco, and damp cotton. The kitchen was her cage, always hot, always smoky, its hearth demanding her constant attention. She kept the stew from burning, the bread from falling, the linens from souring in the wash. And yet, no matter how perfectly she worked, punishment waited in the wings. A word misheard, a dish too cold, a step too slow. Esther was not born on the Harper plantation. Her earliest memories belonged to the Klein household, where her mother had been a seamstress. Her mother's hands were thin but deft, coaxing meaning into thread. She whispered to Esther as she worked, "Cloth can carry words without ink. A hem can hide a secret. A stitch can say what a tongue cannot." Esther listened, wide-eyed, as her mother demonstrated how to fold tiny scraps of parchment into cuffs, how to stitch patterns that seemed decorative but were signals lines and crosses that told a trusted eye when to wait, when to move, when to hope. Her stepfather was different, a charcoal burner whose work filled his lungs with soot but left his arms powerful. He taught her another kind of lesson, one that came with steel. Out in the clearing, with the smell of smoke rising from his kiln, he showed her how to grip an axe so the weight balanced, how to bring it down in a clean line so the wood split without wasted effort. A sharp edge, he told her, is like truth. It cuts through lies if you keep it tended. Esther was small, but she learned to steady her hands, to feel the rhythm of swing and strike, to sharpen the blade until it gleamed even in dim light. From her mother, she learned concealment. From her stepfather, she learned precision. Both lessons were branded into her deeper than any lash could cut. By the time she was sold to the Harpers, her parents were gone. Her mother's hands had grown too slow for the needle. Her stepfather's lungs too black for the kiln. Esther carried their teachings like embers hidden in cloth. Not yet flame, but waiting. On the Harper plantation, she endured and watched. She memorized the way the master's face flushed when drunk, The way Mistress Mary Harper's smile hardened when guests whispered about the family's debts. The way their children swaggered through the quarters with the careless cruelty of heirs. Esther knew where the axes were kept, how the washhouse lock stuck when the air was damp, how the seam of a sheet could carry a code if folded just so. She hid her knowledge beneath bowed eyes and quick obedience. But humiliation never stopped. Guests enjoyed her suffering as much as they enjoyed her food. At one summer gathering, Harper forced her to carry a tray of wine glasses across the parlor while music played. She stumbled slightly, though nothing spilled. He made her start again and again. On the third attempt, he pushed her forward so she fell to her knees, glass shattering around her. The room erupted in laughter, and a child barely old enough to speak pointed and cried, "Dog!" Harper clapped his hands. "Yes, dog," he echoed while Esther rose with glass shards embedded in her skin. That night in the washhouse, she plucked the slivers from her hands in silence, her blood mixing with the soap suds. The quarters whispered of her endurance, though not always with admiration. Some said Esther had grown too cold, that she swallowed insults without flinching. Others said she was dangerous precisely because she never showed her teeth. She neither confirmed nor denied their suspicions. She stitched quietly, scrubbed relentlessly, cooked dutifully, and stored each humiliation like stones in a basket that grew heavier each year. At night, when she lay on her pallet, she sometimes heard the other slaves whispering prayers for freedom. Esther prayed differently. She prayed for clarity, for patience, for the strength to remember each face that laughed at her pain. She prayed to keep her mother's scowl with hidden words and her stepfather's steadiness with the axe. She prayed not for deliverance, but for the day when the weight of humiliation would tip into something else. And in the stillness, when the lanterns were extinguished and the quarters lay quiet, Esther Jones felt the ember inside her shift. Not yet flame. Not yet. But waiting. The summer of 1851 pressed heavy on the Harper plantation. Heat lay over the fields like a suffocating cloth, and even the cicadas seemed weary of their own buzzing. In the quarters, sweat pooled in the hollows of the body, and sleep came only in fits. Yet the Harpers, sitting in their shaded veranda with lemon water in crystal glasses, demanded that the slaves move as though no heat existed, as though their bodies were stone, immune to exhaustion. It was during such a day, when the sky seemed too bright to bear, that Esther's godson Nate was caught with a scrap of bread. He was 9 years old, thin as a reed, his hair tight curled, his eyes always darting with hunger and hope. The bread was nothing more than a heel discarded from the mistress's table, hardened at the edges. He had tucked it beneath his shirt, intending to share it with his younger sister later. But Mistress Mary Harper saw him. She saw not a starving child, but theft, defiance, rebellion in miniature. She called her husband, her voice sharp with outrage. The boy steals from the hand that feeds him. What followed was a spectacle staged for the Harper heirs and their visiting cousins. Nate was dragged to the porch, stripped to the waist, his ribs showing like the bones of a bird. The overseer branded him on the shoulder with a heated iron, the smell of scorched flesh filling the air, the boy's screams cutting through the cicada's song. Then they tied him upright against the post and left him there, trembling, while the guests arrived for evening supper. When Nate collapsed, Esther ran forward, but Mistress Mary blocked her with a single command. "Clean the blood before the guests enter. I will not have them greeted by filth." Esther knelt with her rag and bucket, wiping the porch boards where her godson's flesh had sizzled. The boy moaned behind her, his breath shallow, his body broken, and the guests walked past as if stepping over a stray dog, careful not to soil their polished boots. Something inside Esther hardened then, sharper than any blade. She had endured humiliation, but this was the line carved into her chest. That night, as she lay awake listening to Nate's fevered whimpers from the infirmary, she whispered words her mother had once told her. "A hem can carry a message, a stitch can hide a truth." And from her stepfather, "A blade left idle grows dull, keep it ready." She decided the Harper family would not continue its line unbroken. She would end the family chain at its root. The next day, while others carried baskets of laundry, Esther lingered near the wash-house. There, among the tubs and irons, she pulled a lumber axe from beneath the pile of firewood and slid it behind a stack of linen barrels. She oiled its head, sharpened its edge on a whetstone stolen from the blacksmith's shed, and wrapped the blade in cloth so it would not glint in stray sunlight. The wash-house became her armory. In her own clothing, she began quiet alterations. She sewed narrow loops into the inside of her skirt, hidden from view but strong enough to hold knives or files. Each loop was a secret pocket of steel. When the mistress inspected her garments, she saw only stitches, neat, even, nothing more. But Esther knew they were armor. She also began weaving signals into her daily work. Sheets on the line carried more than the smell of soap. They bore patterns, folds, and knots that told a story to those who knew how to read. A sheet hung with its corner tucked meant wait. A sheet hung with its fold turned inward meant move. To the masters it was laundry. To Esther and her allies it was language. In town, when she was sent with baskets of clothes, she arranged meetings with quiet precision. At the blacksmith's yard, she spoke softly with a freedman who traded tools. For a coin hidden in her shoe and a promise of future favors, she obtained a plowshare file rough, sturdy, sharp enough to wear down shackles if given time. She wrapped it in cloth and concealed it within a quilt she carried home. But vengeance cannot live on preparation alone. It needs companions. Esther tested her trust carefully. Stableman Tom, seamstress Belinda, driver Noah III, whose hearts she had measured over years of whispers and glances. Tom, strong and silent, had once slipped her a stolen carrot when she fainted from hunger. Belinda, with deft hands like her mother's, had sewn extra cloth into Nate's shirt so his wounds would not chafe. And Noah, steady at the reins, had once risked a whipping to drive slower when Esther's feet blistered during errands. To each of them she gave what she called a silence test. She entrusted them with small items, a key fragment, a folded note, a broken blade, and told them to keep it hidden for a week. If discovered, she would know. None failed. Their silence became the ground on which her plan would grow. Meanwhile, the Harpers continued their cruelty, blind to the storm building in the shadows of their own household. At Sunday service, Master Harper made a show of his power. He had intercepted a letter Esther had secretly written. Simple words, a practice exercise in literacy taught by her late mother. He read it aloud to the congregation, mocking her attempt to claim words as her own. "Imagine this creature thinking she can write," he jeered, waving the paper in the air as his guests laughed. Then he ordered Esther to dance in front of them, her feet shuffling on the dirt while the congregation chuckled and clapped. She moved stiffly, her face expressionless, but inside she was coiling tighter, tighter, like a spring wound near breaking. That evening she walked past the well where the Harper children, her master's heirs, played idly with toys. Nate's rag doll lay in their hands, stitched from scraps by Belinda. The children mocked it, pulled at its seams, then tossed it into the well, laughing as it sank. Esther stood still, her body rigid, her breath shallow. She saw Nate watching from the infirmary door, his eyes hollow with pain. It was enough. The plan, which had simmered like a stew left long on the fire, now boiled. No more waiting, no more silence. That night, as cicadas rasped and the sky darkened into black, Esther walked to the wash-house. She unwrapped the axe, ran her hand along its edge, and whispered her mother's words again. A stitch can hide a truth. Then she whispered her stepfather's. A sharp edge is truth itself. In her chest, the ember burst into flame. Summer slid toward autumn, but no cool relief came to the Harper lands. The air hung thick with humidity, heavy as a chain around the neck. Fields of cotton stretched wide and pale under the sun, and the quarters smelled of sweat, mildew, and the faint smoke of evening cook fires. Yet inside the house, life moved to a different rhythm. Carriages arriving, parasols fluttering, gentlemen boasting of harvests, as if human backs were not the soil of their wealth. Esther Jones watched it all with narrowed eyes. The ember inside her had already turned to flame. But fire needs air, and for her plan to breathe, she needed allies 3 who would keep silent, 3 who would not bend under fear. The first was Tom, the stableman. Broad-shouldered, slow to speak, his hands smelled of horse sweat and iron. Tom had once been nearly sold south for striking an overseer, but Harper, fearing the loss of his best handler, relented. Since then, Tom had lived carefully, his temper sheathed, yet beneath his quietness lay a loyalty that Esther had measured and found strong. She approached him first, meeting him in the stables at dusk, the smell of hay thick in the air. "I need the horses," she whispered. "Not tonight, but soon. And when the time comes, they must not be tracked." Tom nodded slowly. "Then I'll turn the shoes backward. They'll think we went east when we went west." He lifted one of the horse's hooves, running his hand along the iron rim. "But you must know, Esther, if they catch me—" "They won't," she cut him off, voice steady. "Not if you trust me." He looked at her then, really looked. Saw the fire in her eyes, the kind that did not flicker. He gave a short nod. "Then we ride false trails." The second was Belinda, the seamstress, quick of hand, sharper of tongue when safe among her own, but pliant as cloth in front of the mistress. Belinda had sewn the rag doll Nate carried everywhere, stitching it from scraps of faded linen and stuffing it with corn husk. She knew the value of small things, of hidden strength in delicate work. Esther spoke to her by the wash line, where sheets snapped in the breeze. "I need the nursery unlocked," Esther said, hanging a cloth with its fold turned inward, a signal they both understood. Belinda hesitated, needle between her lips. "The children sleep there. If I give you the key—" Esther's gaze was iron. "You know what they did to Nate. You know what they'll grow to be." Belinda looked down at her own hands, at the calluses from years of sewing for masters who never said thank you. Then she slid a hand into her apron and pressed a small iron key into Esther's palm. "Keep it hidden," she whispered. "If they search me, I never gave it." The third was Noah, the driver. Tall, lean, his face weathered by sun and road, Noah had guided wagons up and down Carolina's dirt paths for years. He knew every bend in the river, every ferryman who could be bribed, every hollow where a fugitive might hide. Esther spoke to him by the well, while others filled their buckets. "When the time comes, there will be a wagon," she said, "and in that wagon a place where no eye will see." He nodded. "False bottom. I built one once for my brother when he tried to run. They caught him still, but not because of me." His voice broke for a moment, then steadied. "I'll build another. For you. For the boy." Each of them she tested. She called it the silence test. To Tom she gave a small piece of broken chain and told him to keep it hidden for a week. To Belinda a folded scrap of paper with a meaningless mark. To Noah a shard of iron shaped like a key. Each kept their secret, each returned it silently. In their silence Esther heard agreement louder than any oath. Yet still the masters pressed their cruelty deeper, as if sensing rebellion in the air and trying to stamp it out. On Sunday the household gathered for service. The master, swollen with pride, held up a piece of paper and announced that he had intercepted something unusual. It was Esther's letter, the one she had written in secret, practicing the literacy her mother had left her. The words were simple, nothing more than a prayer written in crooked hand. But Harper read it aloud to the congregation, each stumble over her letters, making the guests roar with laughter. "See this creature trying to ape our ways," he mocked. "A Negro scribbler, thinking she belongs to the world of words." The sound of their mirth cut sharper than any lash. Then he ordered Esther forward. "Dance," he said. "Show them what you are good for." So she danced. Not with rhythm, not with joy, but with heavy steps, her body a puppet for their amusement. The congregation laughed, clapped, stamped their boots, until the service felt less like worship and more like theater. She moved until her legs ached, then collapsed to her knees. Harper dismissed her with a wave, as one would a tired dog. That evening, when the sun sank red behind the pines, Esther saw the Harper heirs at play. They were gathered near the well, fat with supper, their pockets jingling with marbles and coins. Nate's doll was in their hands. They mocked it, tugged at its arms until the seams strained, then tossed it high in the air. When it fell into the dust, they laughed. When they grew bored, they hurled it into the well, listening for the splash. Nate, still healing from his branding, watched from a distance. His eyes were wide, his lips pressed tight, his body shaking with silent grief. Esther saw it all, the laughter, the cruelty, the casual destruction of something that carried the boy's only comfort. And she knew. The time for patience had ended. That night she gathered her allies in the wash-house. The air smelled of soap and damp wood. The axe lay hidden in the shadows, wrapped in cloth. Esther spoke low, her voice steady. "Tomorrow we move forward. Tom, you'll set the horses with backward shoes. Belinda, you'll see the nursery doors are ready. Noah, the wagon waits. And I—" She touched the cloth wrapping the axe. "I will do what must be done." They nodded, faces pale but resolute. Belinda crossed herself. Tom clenched his fists. Noah whispered a prayer for the road ahead. Outside, the cicadas sang their endless song, and the night felt thicker than usual, as if the world itself held its breath. Esther returned to her pallet in the quarters, lying awake beside Nate's shallow breathing. She stared at the ceiling, her mind a storm. The ember had long since become flame. Now it burned hot, steady, unstoppable. The Harper heirs had laughed at the doll. Tomorrow they would not laugh. The night arrived without ceremony. Clouds smothered the moon, leaving the Harper plantation shrouded in a restless dark. The air was close, heavy and silent, except for the rasp of insects in the fields and the creak of shutters in the breeze. Inside the quarters, the enslaved lay restless on their pallets, listening to the night with ears sharpened by years of survival. In the big house, lamps burned, late guests gone, heirs dreaming, the master and mistress drunk with wine and the arrogance of ownership. In the wash-house, Esther waited. The axe lay across her lap, its blade wrapped in cloth, its handle smoothed by her stepfather's lessons. Beside it, she carried a strip of leather she had cut from a harness, strong enough to bind, light enough to conceal. Her skirt held its secret loops of steel small blades, stitched into hems, a file tucked near her hip. She sat still, breath even, heart steady. Tonight was not frenzy. Tonight was precision. At the stroke before dawn, Belinda slipped into the house. She moved like a shadow through the hallways, her key pressed into the nursery door. A soft turn, a faint click the lock gave. She eased the shutters loose, letting a breath of outside air whisper into the room. Then she left, closing the door behind her, her hands trembling as she returned to her sewing corner. Moments later, Esther entered. She carried no lamp. Darkness suited her. Her eyes had learned to see in it. Her hands had learned to move through it. She stepped into the nursery, the smell of milk and linen thick in the air. 3 small beds lay against the far wall, where the Harper heirs slept, their breath soft, their bodies curled in the innocence of youth. Innocence, yet already steeped in cruelty. Esther saw not children, but seeds of their father, saplings of tyranny. She approached the first bed. The boy stirred faintly, but did not wake. Esther slipped the strap around his wrists, binding them to the headboard with practiced ease. His breath deepened, the leather holding him still. She moved to the second, repeating the act. Neither stirred beyond a murmur. The third, the eldest, shifted restlessly, half waking. His eyes blinked open, wide with confusion. Before he could cry out, Esther lifted the axe. Not the blade first, but the handle. With one swift movement, she struck across his temple, a blow measured not to kill, but to silence. He slumped back, stunned, breath rasping. The 2 younger heirs stirred, struggling against their straps, but Esther's hand pressed firm over their mouths. No sound escaped beyond muffled whimpers. Then the eldest stirred again, trying to rise, mouth opening to shout. Esther did not hesitate. She pulled the cloth from the axe blade, letting steel catch the faintest glint of dawn. One clean strike. The sound was not of chaos, not of rage. It was the sound of wood split at the hearth. Simple. Final. Silence followed. The nursery held its breath. Only Esther moved, calm as stone, wiping the blade against the coverlet before wrapping it once more. She released the 2 bound boys, leaving them dazed, their eyes wide with terror. They would live, but they would carry memory. The memory of her face, the weight of her silence, the certainty that the chain of inheritance had been cut. Esther turned and slipped back into the hallway. Her footsteps were soft, deliberate, steady as a prayer. In the yard, Noah waited with the wagon. Its false bottom yawned like a second mouth, ready to swallow passengers whole. He stood by the reins, eyes darting, hands clenched on the wood. "Is it done?" he whispered. Esther nodded once. Behind her the house remained still. The first cries would come with the dawn, when the mistress roused her children. By then, Esther would be gone. Noah lifted Nate gently into the wagon, the boy still weak from his branding, but clinging fiercely to Esther's sleeve. Esther climbed in beside him, pulling a shawl over her head, her axe hidden beneath folds of cloth. The wagon creaked forward, wheels groaning softly over the dirt road. Tom had already played his part. Hours earlier, he had lifted each horse's hoof, fitting the shoes backward so that their tracks pointed the wrong way. East would look like west. Pursuit would stumble before it even began. As the wagon rolled past the stables, Tom gave a sharp whistle. Esther looked back once. Their eyes met. No words passed. None were needed. They reached the forest road before the first rooster crowed. Pines loomed on either side, their branches knitting together like ribs of a vast cage. Noah drove with steady hands, guiding the wagon over roots and stones, his face rigid with concentration. In the false bottom beneath the straw, Nate lay hidden, his breath shallow but determined. Behind them, shouts began to rise, the plantation stirring, the overseer discovering the nursery door ajar, the mistress screaming, the master roaring orders. Dogs barked, horns blew. Pursuit had begun. But Tom's deception held. Riders thundered east, following tracks that led nowhere. Esther's wagon rolled west, deeper into the trees, the sound of hooves fading behind them. At the river ferry, dawn broke grey and muted. The ferryman eyed them suspiciously, but Esther's disguise held. She cradled Nate in her arms, his head wrapped in a cloth, his small body concealed beneath her shawl. "I am nurse to Mrs. Hale's boy," she told the ferryman, her voice low, practiced. "We travel to town." He squinted at her, then at Noah, then at the boy. Papers forged by Belinda's careful hand bore Mrs. Hale's name and seal stolen from a scrap of discarded stationery. The ferryman grunted, accepted the papers, and waved them aboard. The river stretched wide, water black with morning shadows. As the ferry drifted across, Esther kept her gaze steady on the far shore. Each creak of rope, each splash of water, felt like a drumbeat pushing her forward. Behind them, the plantation roared with chaos. Ahead lay the uncertain road. In town, they switched the wagon for a fishing boat. Noah traded his driver's reins for an oar, his hands blistering as he rode into open water. Esther sat at the bow, eyes scanning the horizon, Nate curled against her chest. The air smelled of salt, heavy with the promise of distance. For the first time, Esther allowed herself a breath that was not rehearsed. It filled her chest, raw and sharp. She did not smile. She did not weep. She only breathed. The night of vengeance was over. The road of escape had begun. The Harper plantation awoke to screams. At dawn, the mistress stumbled into the nursery to find one son dead, two bound and dazed, their cries choking the air. The master thundered through the house, his rage echoing against the walls, his boots pounding the porch. Riders were dispatched in every direction, dogs unleashed, horns blaring through the pines. But the trails misled them. Tom's reversed horseshoes had turned pursuit into confusion. By the third day, the search stretched 30 miles, yet Esther Jones had vanished. Rumors spread faster than riders could gallop. Some swore she had drowned in the river, others claimed she had slipped north into Quaker lands. Still others whispered of a fishing boat that left the docks at dawn, carrying a woman with an axe hidden beneath her shawl. The county responded with fear. A curfew was imposed on every plantation within 10 miles. Overseers patrolled quarters with doubled whips. Laws forbade slaves from carrying tools after dark. But none of these measures smothered the rumor. A woman with an axe had cut through the Harper chain. Among the masters, the story was retold with fury. Esther as a madwoman, a savage who had betrayed the kindness of her owners. They called her act barbaric, inhuman. Yet among the quarters, the tale took a different shape. There, whispers moved like wind through the fields. She did not scream. She did not beg. She struck once, clean, and vanished. In Wilmington, Esther found refuge among freedmen. Hidden in back rooms and attics, she stitched quilts with coded patterns. Diamonds for safe houses, zigzags for rivers, stars for the north. Girls gathered around her, learning how to sharpen blades under the pretense of cutting cloth. She never spoke of the night directly, but when a girl asked why she taught them, Esther answered only, "Because silence has its time, and steel has its time." The legend grew larger than her body. On distant plantations, field hands whispered that laughter had turned to screams in the Harper house. Mothers rocking their children murmured her name like a prayer. Esther Jones, who cut the chain. Some said she carried the axe still, hidden under her skirts, waiting for the next door to open. Years later, when the story was retold, it always ended the same. The chain was broken where laughter was loudest. To the masters, it was warning. To the enslaved, it was hope. And to Esther herself, living in the shadows of freedom, it was memory-heavy, sharpened, and unforgotten.